This film is not yet rated. Movie review. So this is a documentary. I think this came out in 2006. I say documentary, but it's one of those documentaries that's got a bit of an editorial edge to it. The filmmakers are definitely expressing a point of view. It's a documentary kind of criticizing the MPAA, or the American rating system that's used to rate movies in America. True to title, this film is not yet rated, is not rated. According to Wikipedia, the ratings board gave it an NC-17, but then the uncut version was released without a rating. That's very much in line with the spirit of the film. The whole point of the film is to criticize the ratings board. So it makes sense that they would release an unrated cut of it and just kind of try and not play ball with the ratings board. So, right. It's a fascinating documentary. Well worth tracking down if you haven't seen it. Well worth watching. As far as kind of being entertaining and holding my interest and kind of, entertainment value, I'm going to give this full marks. Now, as far as talking about the content of the film, I'm going to nitpick a few things here. But I guess keep in mind as I nitpick stuff that I highly recommend you track down this film and watch it anyways. So the film is kind of criticizing the ratings board of in America. Yeah, my own views on this. I am anti-censorship. And maybe this is kind of a reaction to the conservative community I grew up in, but I've developed kind of, maybe an extreme view the other way, where I view myself as extremely anti-censorship. That being said, as was made quite clear in this film, the ratings board is voluntary. Studios voluntarily submit their films to this ratings board, and the ratings board is, I think, made up of the Motion Picture Association of America, which is kind of an association of different movie studios. So, I am not against free association. Like if these companies want to kind of band together and use this system, I think that's their freedom of association. I guess the problem we get into is the problem that we get into when talking about any issue of kind of censorship in the media, is the corporate monopoly. The fact that normal people don't own media companies. Yeah. I mean, to me, that seems to be the real issue, the corporate monopoly. But on the face of it, the ratings board is voluntary, and filmmakers voluntarily submit their movies to the ratings board. However, the filmmakers make the criticism of the ratings board as follows. Number one, because studios and distributors refuse to handle films that aren't rated, the voluntary rating system is, in fact, a de facto compulsory system. Number two, because many studios and distributors won't handle films that are rated NC-17, the Film Ratings Board acts as a de facto censorship organization. Kind of any film that's NC-17 is essentially unreleasable. So that's a form of censorship. And the third point they make is a little bit different, but they argue that the Film's Rating Board is much friendlier to big studios than it is to independent films. Much likely to work with big studios to help them get the ratings they want, and much likely to just give big studios the ratings they want. The documentary makes a point that the ratings board are inconsistent, again, kind of being more friendly towards Big studios can get away with stuff in their movies, which would have gotten a higher rating or an NC-17 rating for an independent studio. Also, they make the point that the ratings board has historically been much more tolerant of violence than of sex. In slasher films, you can have slasher films and they can get rated PG-13, main BR, but any sex and it's NC-17. They also make the point that to the extent that sex is allowed in movies, the ratings board is much more tolerant of straight sex than it is of gay or lesbian sex. And to the extent that sex is tolerated, the ratings board is much more tolerant of male sexuality than female sexuality. So, for example, scenes of female orgasm or female masturbation are much more likely to receive the NC-17 rating than something kind of with the equivalent of something happening with men. Now, I think as an indictment of kind of everything that's wrong with the current system, the documentary makes a compelling case as far as it goes. Everybody who watches films regularly, which, let's face it, is all of us, should watch this documentary so that we can be an informed observer about what we are seeing and, more importantly, what we are not seeing whenever we watch a movie. But as to what the best alternative would be, this is where it gets a bit muddled. So, I think this documentary is completely right when they say the rating system is much more tolerant of violence and of sex. So you can have slasher movies, horror movies, where people are getting their throats cut, all this kind of fake gore, whatever. And it gets like an R at the worst, PG-13. You have any kind of sex in this NC-17. So that's arguably an issue. But I think it's a question whether this is something this is a cultural issue created by the ratings board, or whether the ratings board is a reflection of Americans' cultural values. And again, I grew up in a very conservative religious community, so I can attest to the fact that in conservative communities, they are terrified of sex. Now, or any sort of depictions of sex, much more comfortable with violence than sex. And that, I think, that represents a fair percentage of kind of heartland America. Now, you could argue with this view, and I have over the years, and maybe this is a whole separate discussion for a separate video, but this is their view. And if somebody wants to be a Puritan, and they want to be a Puritan in the privacy of their own home, then maybe it's not a terrible thing that there's a rating system that kind of reflects their values. So, if you don't want to see any sex in your movies, fine. Everyone's got the right to kind of, be for, to the extent that the rating system is just kind of warning people what they might see in the movies or might not see in the movies. I have no problem with people being Puritans in the privacy of their own home and kind of selecting which kind of movies they want to see based on the rating system, even if that, in my view, or the view of other people, kind of represents something that's skewed kind of more towards the anti-sex angle. Whatever, that's their freedom. I guess the problem, again, is that the NC-17 ratings are acting, again, as a kind of a de facto form of censorship, because the studios and distributors and the movie theaters are just refusing to touch them. So, yeah, maybe that's less of a problem with the rating system per se and more of a problem with the distribution system. Yeah, it's a complicated issue when you think of what's going to replace it. I think the big problem is corporate monopoly of the media. And they only touch on this very briefly in this documentary. Could have expanded on this much more. Arguably, this is the issue that's at the heart of the problem. One of the filmmakers interviewed, because they interviewed different filmmakers for the film, goes so far as to say the ratings board is a fascist institution. Another one says that if films have to be censored, it would be preferable to have the government censor the films, because at least the government has some sort of accountability. That's another theme in this movie, by the way, is how the MPAA ratings board has kind of no accountability. The members are kept secret. Nobody knows who they are. Kind of no way to appeal it and stuff like that. So, yeah, an interesting point of view that we should have the government be doing the censorship. I mean, obviously we shouldn't be having the government do the censorship, but you can kind of see a little bit where they're coming from, huh? I mean, if this ratings board is going to kind of act as a de facto censorship board, then maybe it should have some sort of accountability. I think the idea of having the government do it is obviously kind of tongue-in-cheek. Nobody wants the government censoring movies. But then, later in the documentary, they start making the case that violence is more harmful than sex, or depictions of violence in media are more harmful than depictions of sex. You know, like you watch sex on the movie screen, what's that going to do to you? But you watch violence on a movie screen, and that could make you more violent. I don't actually believe that, actually. I don't know what I believe. I'm skeptical of that. But they seem to be making that case in the movie that exposure to violence could have more of a negative social effect than exposure to sex on the movie. And they even go so far as to make the case that the film violence in media is at least partly responsible for gun incidents like Columbine. And make the case that it should be more heavily regulated. Now, here you're really getting into trouble. Because if you're implying that this violence is causing societal problems, then you're implying that it should be regulated. And that you need some sort of oversight. But then whose values are you going to have there? I mean, is the Puritan going to decide which films get rated, or is the pacifist going to decide what films get rated? We've got conflicting ideological viewpoints here in America. And there are some interesting discussions to be had over kind of which viewpoints are right. I have my own biases. But if you're talking about a film rating system which has to be accessible for everyone, then you can't argue out the ideology. I mean, you argue out the ideology elsewhere. Here you're just saying, okay, what can we all agree on is some sort of criteria. So yeah, it gets complicated. To be fair, some of these issues are outside of the scope of the film. I think this film is just seeking to highlight the problem. Maybe they're not necessarily proposing any concrete solution. But yeah, the moment we start thinking about what a solution would be, the more these issues start to pop up. In addition to the ratings, film also looks briefly at a few other issues. Issues like the movie industry lobbying Congress against piracy and some of the draconian anti-piracy laws that have been produced as a result. And also they talk about the Pentagon's influence on Hollywood. Now this is actually something I've known for quite some time. I used to hang out with peace activists back in college. And you pick up these pieces of information. But the Pentagon has this program in place where if there's a Hollywood script that's portraying the U.S. Army in a positive way, the Pentagon will, at taxpayer expense, kind of loan out its personnel to the movie studios and kind of loan out its equipment and kind of help help train the extras, or kind of sometimes even, I think, Army people, soldiers are in the movie as extras, kind of loaned out by the Army. They provide all this assistance to any movie that is portraying the U.S. Army in a positive light. Any army that's not portraying the U.S. Army in a positive light does not get anything. So you can imagine, as a result of this, there are a lot of movies portraying the U.S. Army in a positive light, which is a problem to begin with. But then the bigger problem, and they said this in the documentary, one of the people interviewed said, you will never know how many films have never gotten made because of this rule. So, you know, any script that's kind of has an anti-war theme or portraying the U.S. Army in a negative light is not going to get greenlit in Hollywood because they won't have access to all those technical assistants. You know, they'd have to kind of go out and kind of pay for all the helicopters themselves instead. It also, the fact that the U.S. Army is loaning this equipment out to Hollywood free of charge for scripts that they like, means that your government, if you're American, is using your tax dollars to propagandize you through the entertainment you watch, which that is very disturbing, should be very disturbing. So, you know, to me, I mean, I know this is a little bit outside of the scope of the film, or this wasn't their major focus, but to me this almost should be the major focus. I mean, to me this is a much bigger issue than the fact that some sex scene got cut out from some movie. The fact that we've got a system in place where Hollywood movies are portraying kind of an overwhelmingly positive view of the U.S. Army, and are almost, by this system, not allowed to produce anything that's critical of the U.S. Army. That, I think, is much more important than some sort of lesbian sex scene that got cut out of a movie somewhere. So, yeah, I mean, I'm glad that this documentary spent 5 minutes on this. They could have spent a lot longer on it, in my opinion. Well, I don't know. Maybe they said what they needed to say in the 5 minutes. Maybe that's all there was to say. But yeah, if I was making a documentary, I think that would be the issue I'd be more concerned about. Anyways, it's a little bit unfair, isn't it? The rule of film reviewing is review the film that you saw, not the film that you wished you had seen. And the object of this film is to kind of complain about the ratings board and its kind of bias against sex and its kind of inherent censorship qualities. It is, again, to return to the point I started with, well worth watching. I obviously have some quibbles around the edges of it, but it's a very solid documentary.